So our next unit is on ecology, and the first section of this unit is on energy flow. So ecology is the study of the interactions between biotic and abiotic parts of the environment. Biotic means living, and so examples of biotic factors in the environment would be animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, and protists. Abiotic factors are non-living things in the environment. And so this would be air, water, soil, climate. There are 6 levels of ecological organization when we are talking about ecology. The smallest level is an individual organism. That would be one individual of a species. The next level, getting a little bit larger, is a population. A population is a group of individuals of the same species at the same place at the same time. Getting a little bit bigger, we have a community. Community is different populations that live in the same environment. An ecosystem is the community of all those different populations and the abiotic parts of the environment. A biome is a large geographical area where the same ecosystem can be found. And then the biosphere is the sum total of all ecosystems, and it's where all living things exist. Some organisms are labeled as producers. Producers can also be called autotrophs. And producers or autotrophs use environmental energy sources to make their own usable energy or their own food. And that's why they're called autotrophs, because they're doing this by themselves, or they're called producers because they're producing their own usable energy. Examples of producers or autotrophs are plants, some bacteria, and algae. There's 2 different ways that producers can actually do this. And that means that some of them are photosynthetic autotrophs. Photosynthetic autotrophs perform photosynthesis. And that's the process of using sunlight as an environmental energy source. And then from that, they're able to produce glucose, which is a carbohydrate. And that's what they use as their usable energy or their food. Most producers are photosynthetic autotrophs. Other producers are chemosynthetic autotrophs, and these producers perform chemosynthesis. And in chemosynthesis, organisms use inorganic chemicals as their environmental energy source rather than sunlight. An example of chemosynthesis occurs in hydrothermal vents, which are deep in the ocean. Another example of chemosynthesis occurs in hot water springs, like those found in Yellowstone. Those colorations that you see have to do with the chemosynthetic bacteria that live in those hot springs that are using the chemicals to produce their own food. Here's a comparison of photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. Other organisms are categorized as consumers. Consumers are also called heterotrophs, and that's because they use other organisms as their food. That's their energy source. And so they're called consumers because they must consume, and heterotrophs because they're getting their energy from a different source. Consumers can be further subdivided based on what they eat and how they get their energy. Herbivores eat plants. Carnivores eat animals, and omnivores eat both plants and animals. Decomposers break down detritus, and detritus is dead organic matter. And so sometimes decomposers are called detritivores for that reason. Energy flow in an ecosystem. So the sun is the major energy source for most ecosystems. And a food chain is a biotic pathway that shows the transfer of energy from one organism to another. Energy only flows in one direction. A food chain always begins with a producer or an autotroph. And that's because they're producing energy for themselves, either by photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Producers also produce energy for anything that consumes them. In a food chain, arrows show the direction of energy flow, and the arrows always go from the food to who eats it, because we're showing where the energy starts and who then gets the energy. The sun is never included in a food chain, and that's because the sun is abiotic and food chains are biotic only. So to create a food chain, you start with an autotroph, and then you list the organisms in the order that they eat one another. Arrows are needed to show the direction of energy flow, and the arrows must go in the correct direction. The point of the arrow shows who ate what and who got the energy. The arrow in the picture on the top tells us that the grasshopper ate and got energy from the grass. The arrow in the diagram on the bottom tells us that the grass ate and got energy from the grasshopper, which is not accurate. The grass made energy from the sun, water, air, and soil. And in this example, the rabbit got energy by eating the grass, and the fox got energy by eating the rabbit. Here are some other examples of food chains. Remember, food chains show the passage of energy between organisms. So we would not include the sun on any food chain. A trophic level is each step in a food chain or a food web, which we'll talk about in a little bit. On the food chain in the diagram on the slide, there are 4 different trophic levels. Ecologists refer to the trophic level or feeding level to describe the position of an organism along a food chain. If one trophic level of a food chain is altered, the whole food chain is affected. It can result in a chain reaction of negative effects. For example, if a disease suddenly wiped out all the caterpillars, Certain plants may become overpopulated, and these can crowd out other plants. There would be less food for the birds, and this will cause the birds to starve and their population to decrease. There will be less food for the owls. This will cause the owls to starve and their population to decrease. Furthermore, other organisms not shown here in this food chain would also be affected. And that's because real ecosystems have many more complex relationships that a food chain alone doesn't show. A more accurate and complex relationship in an ecosystem are shown in a food web. A food web consists of many interconnected food chains that shows the many complex energy transfer relationships in a real ecosystem. Food chains follow just one path as animals find food, but food webs show how plants and animals are connected in many ways to help them all survive. So we're going to make an example food web in our notes. So first we need a template on which to make our food web like the one shown below. And you should have this in your notes. Next, we need to read the passage and place organisms into the correct trophic level based on the information given. So here's our example of an Alaskan food web. The grizzly bears that live on the coast of Alaska are the largest animals in the world that eat meat. They eat moose, ground squirrels, and fish. They also eat berries. Moose and ground squirrels eat grass and seeds. Fish eat insects, and the insects eat off of the berries, seeds, and grass. Many other plants and animals live in Alaska. Birds eat seeds, berries, insects, and fish. Foxes eat fish, birds, and ground squirrels. Fungi, maggots, and bacteria will break down all dead organisms and their waste. To simplify this, when we're placing organisms on the trophic levels, we only want to use the information given in the passage. So we're going to be specifically focusing on the information that we're given. And this is how we would place the organisms from that passage. Here, I've placed the passage and trophic levels side by side with the organisms and trophic levels color-coded. So you can see that grizzly bears belong on the omnivore. It tells us that they eat meat like moose, ground squirrel, and fish, but they also eat berries. Berries, and in the next paragraph, grass and seeds are producers. They're plants that are doing photosynthesis. Next, in that second paragraph, it tells us that moose and ground squirrel eat grass and seeds, which makes them herbivores. Fish eat insects, and so fish would be a carnivore, and the insects eat off of the berries, seeds, and grass. So insects would be an herbivore. In the third paragraph, birds eat seeds, berries, insects, and fish. So that would make the birds omnivores. And foxes eat fish, birds, and ground squirrels. So that would make those carnivores. And then in the last paragraph, fungi, maggots, and bacteria will break down all dead organisms and their waste, making them decomposers. Next, we draw arrows showing every feeding relationship mentioned in the passage, except for decomposers for now. So we're going to show every other feeding relationship except for decomposers at this point. So for example, in that first paragraph, it says the grizzly bears that live on the coast of Alaska are the largest animals in the world that eat meat. They eat moose, ground squirrels, and fish. They also eat berries. So right there, we have 4 arrows that we need to draw on the food web. We need an arrow from moose to grizzly bear, from ground squirrels to grizzly bear, from fish to grizzly bear, and from berries to grizzly bear. All of those arrows will start with the food source. So they'll all start on either the moose, ground squirrel, fish, or berries. And all of them will be pointing to grizzly bear, since grizzly bear is doing the eating. So here are all the arrows that should be drawn on the food web. And here I have posted a side-by-side so you can look at the story and compare the arrows that have been drawn. So now back to the decomposers. Everything on our food web will get decomposed upon death. And if we were to show that, that would add approximately 40 more arrows. So instead, we're going to use a shortcut for the decomposers. We will draw 1 arrow from each trophic level to the decomposers, showing everything on that level will be decomposed. Ecological pyramids are representations of relationships between different organisms in a food web of an ecosystem. And there are 3 types. There is a pyramid of numbers, a pyramid of energy, and a pyramid of biomass. One ecological pyramid is a pyramid of numbers. And a pyramid of numbers shows the population of organisms at each level in a food chain. It does not consider the sizes of the organisms, just the number. At higher levels, no predator can be as common as its prey. And that's because it would cause the population of both animals to be wiped out. So here's an example of a pyramid of numbers. We need to start with a pyramid. The base, the largest part of the pyramid, represents the organism with the largest population. And the top, the smallest part of the pyramid, represents the organism with the smallest population. And so if we use the following food chain, grass, grasshopper, mouse, and owl, producers are plentiful and have a huge population. 1 blade of grass is 1 individual. And because they are placed on the bottom of the pyramid. For grasshoppers to survive, they need to have plenty of available food. There needs to be more grass to support the grasshoppers. So grasshoppers are then placed on the next level of the pyramid. For mice to survive, they need to have plenty of available food. Mice are placed on the next level as there needs to be more grasshoppers for the mice to survive. And for owls to survive, they need to have plenty of available food. And so owls are placed on the next level as there needs to be more mice than owls for the owls to survive. An energy pyramid shows the amount of energy passed through a food chain. A majority of the energy present at one trophic level is not available for the next. And that's because 90% of the energy that's produced by autotrophs or that's consumed by heterotrophs is used. And it's used for growth, life processes, reproduction, and other activities. Once the energy is used, it's converted and released as heat energy, which is unusable for work. That leaves 10% of the energy being stored in body tissues. Tissues such as plant stems, plant leaves, muscles of animals, etc. It's that 10% that's available to pass on when one organism eats another. So here's an energy pyramid example. Once again, we start with a pyramid. And the base, the largest part of the pyramid, represents the organism with a great amount of original energy. And the top, or the smallest part of the pyramid, represents the organism with the least amount of the original energy. If we once again use the food chain of grass, grasshopper, mouse, and owl, producers produce their own energy through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. The energy of the food chain begins with them, and they're placed on the bottom of the pyramid. The grasshoppers eat the grass and get some of the grass's energy. They received only a fraction of the original energy, and they're placed on the next level of the pyramid. Mice eat the grasshoppers and get some of the grasshopper's energy. They received only a fraction of the original energy, and they're placed on the next level of the pyramid. And the owl eats the mice and gets some of the mice's energy. It received only a fraction of the original energy, and it's placed on the top level of the pyramid. Labels need to be placed on the pyramid to show the passage of energy. The grass produces energy for itself. It's an autotroph. It also is actually, without trying, the producer of energy for the whole food chain, or the heterotrophs. The grass uses most of its energy, 90%, for growth, reproduction, and other life processes. This is released as heat and therefore unavailable for the next level. The remaining 10% is stored in body tissues, and it's this 10% that's available to pass on to the grasshopper when they feed on the grass. The grasshopper uses most of its energy, and this is released as heat and therefore unavailable for the next level. The remaining 10% is stored in body tissues, and this 10% is available to pass on to the mouse when they feed on the grasshopper. The mouse uses most of its energy, and this is released as heat unavailable for the next level. The remaining 10% is stored in body tissues, and this 10% is available to pass on to the owl. The owl uses most of its energy, and this is released as heat. The owl is the top predator in this food chain. Now we can use this information to apply actual amounts of energy. Energy is measured in calories. Assume that the grass produced 1,000 calories of energy for itself. The grasshopper received 10% of those 1,000 calories, which means the grasshopper receives 100 calories of that original energy. The mouse received 10% of the grasshopper's 100 calories, meaning the mouse receives 10 calories of that original energy. And finally, the owl received 10% of the mouse's 10 calories, which means the owl receives only 1 calorie of the original energy. The third kind of ecological pyramid is a biomass pyramid. And a biomass pyramid is the actual mass of living organisms, and it represents the amount of potential food available. Biomass takes into account population and the size of the organism. So biomass would equal the population size times the average mass of an individual. Lower levels must have greater biomass than successive layers. Lower levels biomass is food for the higher levels. Here's a biomass pyramid example. So once again, we start with a pyramid, and the base is the largest part of the pyramid, which represents the organism with the greatest amount of biomass. On the top or the smallest part of the pyramid represents the organism with the least amount of biomass. If we once again use the food chain of grass, grasshopper, mouse, and owl, producers produce their own energy through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. They produce great amounts of biomass and they're placed on the bottom of the pyramid. To survive, the grasshoppers depend on a greater amount of biomass as their food, and they're placed on the next level of the pyramid. To survive, the mice depend on a greater amount of biomass as their food, and they're placed on the next level of the pyramid. And then finally, to survive, the owl depends on a greater amount of biomass as their food, and so they're placed on the top level of the pyramid. Connections between pyramids. Biomass, population, and energy are all interrelated. If an organism has more energy, they can devote more to reproduction, which will increase the population, and then that will also increase the biomass.